Mark Donovan stepped out of his sleek black sedan, straightening his tailored navy blue suit and adjusted his silver Rolex as he walked down the bustling city street. High-rise buildings cast long shadows over the sidewalk, crowded with hurried pedestrians rushing about their daily tasks. It was an ordinary day in the life of one of the city's wealthiest and most influential businessmen, yet Mark felt an inexplicable sense of emptiness. He turned the corner toward the Central Park district, seeking the calm that nature's presence often provided him amidst the noise of urban life. Passing by shops and cafes, Mark was suddenly drawn to the faint yet hauntingly beautiful voice of a little girl singing softly near the park's entrance. Curious, he followed the melody and found a young child, about 7 years old, with curly blonde hair and innocent blue eyes, sitting on a worn blanket beside her mother. The mother's weary green eyes locked briefly onto Mark's, before quickly dropping with embarrassment. She had shoulder-length tangled blonde hair and was visibly tired, her slender face pale, marked by hardship, yet softened by kindness. Mark glanced down, noticing several drawings neatly laid out on the ground in front of them, each carefully sketched with vivid colors despite their humble paper. His eyes were captivated by one drawing in particular, depicting a beautiful wooden swing hanging from a tall oak tree, a small boy playing joyfully beneath it. For a moment, the world around him seemed to blur as an overwhelming sense of déjà vu surged through him. "How much for that one?" Mark asked abruptly, surprising even himself with the sudden urge. $10, sir," Emily replied hesitantly, clearly startled by the wealthy stranger's attention. Without thinking, Mark reached into his wallet, withdrawing a $100 bill, handing it to Emily. Her eyes widened in shock, glancing nervously back up at him. "But, sir, it's too much." "No, keep it," Mark interrupted, smiling faintly. "You deserve it." The little girl beamed brightly, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you so much," she exclaimed happily. Her mother gently squeezed her daughter's hand, gratitude evident in her tired smile. Mark carefully picked up the drawing, folded it neatly, and slid it inside his coat pocket, feeling strangely connected to the humble sketch. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the odd familiarity he felt, a distant echo of his forgotten past. Back at his luxurious penthouse, Mark poured himself a drink and settled into his expensive leather armchair, gently unfolding the drawing. Once more, as he studied it closely, a shiver ran down his spine. His heart pounded as the truth dawned upon him. This drawing was not just any random scene, it was a precise depiction of a moment from his own childhood, a memory he had long suppressed, buried beneath layers of wealth and success. His breath quickened as confusion and intrigue swirled within him. How could she possibly know about this? He whispered to himself, eyes fixed in disbelief at the drawing. His fingers trembled as he traced the image. And suddenly, Mark knew he had to find Emily again, for their meeting was clearly more than just chance. This encounter would lead him down a path he never imagined, uncovering secrets hidden deep within the tapestry of his life, forever changing his heart, his destiny, and theirs. Mark couldn't sleep. All night he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the drawing resting on the nightstand beside him like a relic from another life. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned, his small hands gripping the ropes of the swing, his mother's, distant laughter echoing in the breeze, the oak tree towering above. He hadn't thought of that place in decades. How could a stranger, a homeless woman, have captured it so vividly? At sunrise, Mark was already dressed, the usually tedious morning rituals, espresso, protein smoothie, reading financial reports, were abandoned. Something deeper pulled him, something unexplainable. He grabbed the drawing, slipped it into a leather folder, and left his penthouse without telling his assistant or driver. Downtown was waking up slowly. Cafes opened their doors, street vendors arranged their displays, and the early city light bathed everything in a golden hue. Mark scanned every corner near the park entrance from the day before, but Emily and the little girl were nowhere in sight. He searched for an hour. Just when he was about to give up, he spotted them a few blocks down, nestled in the doorway of a closed bookstore. Emily was sketching quietly while her daughter played with a piece of chalk, drawing flowers on the sidewalk. "Hey," Mark called gently as he approached. Emily looked up, startled. Recognition lit her face, followed by wariness. She stood, instinctively positioning herself slightly in front of her daughter. "I'm sorry," Mark said, raising his hands. I needed to talk to you." Emily said nothing, her eyes cautious. Mark pulled out the drawing and held it toward her. "This place. How did you draw this?" Emily blinked. "I don't understand. It's just something from my dreams. I see it often. Always the same tree, the swing, the little boy." Mark's voice cracked. "That boy was me. That place was real. It's from my childhood." Emily's eyes widened and she stared at the drawing, visibly shaken. "But I've never been there." "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Emily, and this is Sophie," she replied, placing her hand on her daughter's shoulder. The little girl smiled up at him. Mark crouched down. "Hi, Sophie, that's a beautiful song you were singing yesterday." "Thank you," she beamed. "Mama taught me." He looked up at Emily. "Can I buy you both breakfast? I just want to talk. I promise, nothing weird." Emily hesitated, but something in his tone, genuine, kind, maybe even a little desperate, moved her. She nodded slowly. A small corner diner welcomed them in with the scent of fresh pancakes and coffee. The staff gave them curious glances, but Mark ignored it. They took a booth near the window, and for a moment they were just three people. No rich man, no homeless mother, sharing a quiet morning. Emily watched him closely. "You really think that drawing is from your life?" "I don't think," Mark replied. "I know, there's no way you could have imagined it so precisely. The swing, the way the roots twist at the base of the tree, the red scarf on the boy. That scarf was mine. My mother gave it to me." Emily's brow furrowed. "I started drawing scenes like that years ago. Always the same boy, always the same tree. I didn't know why." Sophie leaned forward. "Sometimes Mama draws things she dreams about. She says the pictures help her feel less sad." Mark's heart ached. "I want to understand this. Emily, I want to help you. And maybe you can help me too." The waitress refilled their coffees. The three sat in silence, the drawing between them. It was the beginning of something neither of them could explain, but neither could walk away from. The diner quieted as the breakfast crowd thinned. The morning sun glinted off the silver cutlery and polished surfaces, but Emily barely touched her food. She kept glancing at Mark between sips of coffee, unsure of how much she should trust him, or herself. Mark noticed. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said gently. "I know I just appeared out of nowhere." Emily gave a faint smile. "Honestly, it's hard to know who to trust when you've had nothing for so long." He nodded. "I can imagine." "No," she said softly. "You really can't." A pause hung in the air. Sophie, content with her pancake, began humming. Again. Her innocence was like sunlight cutting through fog, brief but blindingly pure. Mark leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I wasn't always like this. Rich, I mean. My family had money, yes, but we weren't close. Not after my mother died. I was sent away to boarding school when I was 10. I don't remember much before." At that, Emily's eyes softened slightly. "I remember too much." Mark waited. "I grew up in and out of foster care," she said slowly. "My mom disappeared when I was 5. No one ever found her. They just said she must have run away. Drugs, maybe. Or maybe she was hurt. I don't know. Do you remember her?" "Only in flashes. Her perfume. Her humming while she cooked. Her hands always smelled like lemon soap. I used to draw her over and over, until one day I couldn't picture her face anymore. That's when the dreams started. Mark felt something tighten in his chest. Dreams of the swing? She nodded. The tree. The boy. Sometimes I felt like I was supposed to be there, like I missed a life that never happened. He stared at her, unable to shake the growing feeling that their lives had been meant to cross paths long before now. "How do you survive out here?" he asked, carefully shifting the topic. "I do small jobs when I can," she said. "Cleaning houses, sketching portraits in the park. We go to shelters sometimes, but they're not always safe. I'd rather sleep outside than risk Sophie being hurt." Mark's jaw clenched. He looked at Sophie again, so full of life despite everything, and then back at Emily. Her strength humbled him. "You're incredible," he said. She blinked, caught off guard. "I mean it. You've kept your daughter safe and loved. That's more than most people do with everything handed to them." Emily looked down, her eyes glassy. "I'm just trying to hold on to something, anything." Mark opened his wallet again, pulling out a sleek business card. "Look, I'm not trying to rescue you, but I have resources. I can help." Emily stared at the card but didn't take it. "Why?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe because I see something in you I lost a long time ago. Maybe because that drawing reminded me of who I was before all this." She hesitated, then slowly reached for the card. Their fingers brushed. "Just let me help, Emily, even if it's just getting you and Sophie a warm place to sleep tonight." Emily exhaled shakily. "Okay." Mark gave a slight smile. "Thank you." And just like that, a doorway opened between two distant worlds. His, of glass towers and billion-dollar deals, hers of chalk drawings and dreams that never faded. They both had no idea how deep that doorway went. But they were about to find out. The ride to Mark's estate was quiet, but not tense, more like the silence before a revelation. Emily sat in the back seat beside Sophie, her hands folded in, her lap, eyes scanning the changing scenery as they left the busy downtown for the leafy, well-manicured neighborhoods on the city's northern edge. Sophie pressed her nose to the window, marveling at the fountains and flower gardens they passed. Mark occasionally glanced at them in the rearview mirror. He felt the weight of their presence, how out of place they seemed against the luxury of his world, and yet something about them already felt familiar, as if the gap between their lives was not so wide after all. As they pulled through the wrought-iron gates of the Donovan estate, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The mansion stood like something out of a magazine. White stone, ivy crawling up the pillars, balconies wrapped in wrought iron. The vast lawn sparkled with early dew, and a long cobblestone driveway curved up to the front entrance. "This is where you live?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, stepping out of the car. "Yes, but you won't be staying in the main house. I thought you might feel more comfortable with some space." He led them down a stone path that branched off from the main driveway and toward a charming guest house tucked beneath a canopy of trees. It was quaint and warm, with flower boxes in the windows and smoke gently curling from the chimney. Emily's wary expression softened slightly. "This used to be the caretaker's quarters when I was a kid," Mark said. "I renovated it a few years ago. It's private, secure, yours, for as long as you need." He handed her a key. Emily took it slowly. Inside, the guest house was cozy and sunlit. A small kitchen, a living room with plush chairs and bookshelves, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with fresh towels already folded. A basket of fruit and snacks sat on the counter, along with a small vase of flowers. Sophie rushed inside and twirled in the middle of the living room. "It's like a little castle," Mark laughed. "I'm glad you like it." Emily followed more slowly, her fingers trailing along the edge of a polished table, eyes cautious but filled with wonder. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, turning to face him. because something in that drawing brought me back to a piece of myself I didn't even know I'd lost," he said, "and because I think you and I are connected by more than coincidence." She looked at him carefully. "You don't know me, Mark. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I want to know you." Emily held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Okay." That evening, Mark returned with dinner, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and a box of pastries. They sat at the small wooden table in the guest house, and for the first time in years, Emily and Sophie ate without worry of where the next meal would come from. After Sophie fell asleep curled up on the guest bed, Emily and Mark sat across from each other with cups of tea, the silence between them comfortable now. "Tell me about your family," Emily asked quietly. Mark stared into his cup. "My parents died when I was in college. Car accident. My sister and I inherited the estate, but we drifted apart over the years. I buried myself in work. And the tree, the swing?" His brow furrowed. "It was in the backyard of our summer house. We'd spend weeks there every year as kids. That moment, me playing under the oak tree, it was the last truly happy memory I have of my parents before everything changed." Emily shivered. "I never had a memory like that. I only ever saw it in dreams." Mark leaned forward. "Then maybe those dreams are memories. Maybe we shared something long ago." She didn't answer, but her eyes glistened. The questions were building, the invisible thread between them pulling tighter. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the trees. Inside, two broken lives had taken a fragile step toward healing, unaware of just how deep their connection ran. The next morning, Mark stood by the window of his penthouse, holding a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes were fixed on the skyline, but his thoughts were far away, somewhere beneath the limbs of an old oak tree in a summer long gone. The drawing sat on the table behind him, still as haunting as the first time he'd seen it. Something wasn't adding up. How could Emily have seen a moment from his life, one that took place over 30 years ago, on private property far from the city, when she had never been there? There was only one person left who might hold the missing pieces, his sister, Anna. They hadn't spoken in over a year. After their parents' deaths, Anna had stepped back from the family empire, choosing a quieter life teaching art at a small university upstate. Mark resented her for abandoning him with the weight of their inheritance, but deep down, he missed her. He picked up the phone. "Mark?" Anna's voice came through after a pause, guarded but not cold. "Hey, I know it's been a while. Over a year. I need to talk to you. It's important." Anna hesitated. "Are you okay?" "I'm not sure, but it's about the house. The swing, Mom and Dad." Another pause. "Then, I'll be home this afternoon. If you want to come up, I'll make tea." Anna's cottage was a modest, ivy-covered home near a lake, surrounded by towering maples. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke. She welcomed him with a cautious hug and led him inside. Mark sat at her kitchen table, tapping the drawing against his knee. "I met someone," he began. "A woman named Emily. She's homeless, has a daughter. But that's not the strange part." He slid the drawing across the table. Anna studied it, her face drained of color. "Mark," she whispered, that's our swing, our tree. I know, and that's me in the picture. But Emily, through this, she's never seen our summer house. She says the image came to her in dreams." Anna sat back, visibly shaken. "She's the spitting image of the housekeeper we had when we were little," Mark said quietly. "You remember her?" "Alice Carter," Anna nodded slowly. "I remember Mom fired her suddenly. I asked why, and she said Alice had crossed a line." "What kind of line?" "She never said, just that we weren't allowed to see her again. And then she was gone." Mark leaned forward. "Emily is Alice's daughter." Anna stared at him, stunned. She was 5 when Alice disappeared, spent her life in the foster system. She says she doesn't remember much, but she's been drawing this same scene for years. I don't believe in coincidences, Anna murmured. Neither do I. Anna stood and walked to an old cabinet. She returned with a photo album, flipping through its pages until she found a worn Polaroid. A young boy, Mark, laughing on a swing, and just behind him, slightly out of focus, a woman with long blonde hair kneeling beside a little girl. Mark's breath caught. That's her, that's Emily. She must have visited with her mom, Anna whispered. Maybe only once, but long enough for that memory to be etched in her mind. And if Alice worked for our family, maybe she brought Emily with her one summer. Maybe you played together. Mark stared at the photo. The moment was frozen in time, fragile and profound. I have to tell her. Anna reached across the table and took his hand. And you have to find out what happened to Alice. She didn't just disappear, Mark. Someone made her disappear. Mark's heart pounded. The answers were there, just below the surface of their childhood, and he was ready to dig them up, no matter what it revealed. Back at the guest house, Emily was folding Sophie's clothes when she heard the door open. Mark stepped in, the drawing still in his hand, his expression unreadable but intense. She looked up from the couch, sensing immediately that something had shifted. I found my sister, he said. We talked. Emily set the clothes aside. And? Mark sat across from her, holding the drawing between them again. She recognized it too, the swing, the tree, the red scarf. It's real, all of it. Emily didn't speak. There's more, he added. My sister remembered the woman who used to work for us when we were kids. Her name was Alice. Emily froze. Alice Carter. Her lips parted, her breath catching. That's my mother's name. Mark leaned forward, voice gentler now. I think you were here, Emily, at our summer house. Once, maybe more. You must have been 4 or 5. My parents fired your mother suddenly. My sister said they wouldn't talk about it. She vanished after that. Emily's eyes welled. I always thought she left me, that she ran away, but she wouldn't have just left me, not unless something happened. Mark nodded slowly. I don't think she left you. I think something happened that they didn't want anyone to know. She sat back, her face pale. All those years in foster care, I thought I was just abandoned. I don't think you were. Sophie wandered out of the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. Mama. Emily quickly wiped her cheeks and pulled her daughter into her lap. It's okay, sweetheart. We're just talking. Mark smiled at Sophie. Hey, champ, what do you think about staying here for a little while longer? Sophie nodded eagerly. I love it here. It smells like pancakes. Emily chuckled softly, kissing her daughter's forehead. After Sophie returned to bed, Mark turned to Emily again. There's more I want to show you, but only if you're ready. Emily looked at him for a long time. You keep doing this, she said. Doing what? Giving me reasons to believe, when I've spent most of my life learning not to. Mark's expression softened. Then let me keep trying. That night, Mark made arrangements for Emily and Sophie to stay indefinitely. A team came quietly to install better locks, restock the kitchen, and leave toys and art supplies for Sophie. He gave Emily a prepaid phone, new clothes, and an envelope with emergency cash. Still, she remained cautious, not because she didn't trust him, but because trust had always come at a cost. Before leaving, Mark handed her a second drawing. I found this in an old photo album, he said. You're in it, you and your mom, behind me, at the swing. Emily stared at the faded photo. Her fingers trembled as she held it. For the first time, a piece of her missing past clicked into place. That's me, she whispered. I don't remember the moment, but I remember the feeling, the sun on my face, the smell of pine trees. Mark sat beside her. We were our kids, We didn't know anything then, but somehow we knew each other. Emily turned the photo over. On the back was scribbled a date, June 12th, 1991. "That was the last summer I ever saw my mother," she said. They sat in silence, the years folding in around them like pages of a book, pages they were now reading together. The next morning, Emily sat on the guest house porch, watching Sophie chase butterflies in the garden. The soft buzz of bees in the lavender bushes and the chirping of birds made it feel like a world away from the shelters, alleys, and cold sidewalks she had known for too long. Mark arrived carrying a slim folder, his jaw tight with focus. He joined her on the steps, offering a gentle smile before handing her the folder. "I had my assistant dig into some old employment records from our estate," he said, "and I found something." Emily hesitated before opening it. Inside were scanned documents, faded pages from the early 90s. One was a signed employment form from Alice Carter, listing her position as live-in domestic assistant for the Donovan family. Another was a termination notice, dated 2 months after the photo Mark had shown her. The reason for dismissal: violation of household boundaries and personal trust. "What does that even mean?" Emily asked, her voice low. Mark shook his head. "It's vague on purpose, but there's more. I had one of my investigators follow the trail. Alice's last known address was a rented room in a boarding house in East Ridge. She stayed there for just 3 days after leaving our estate. Then she was gone, no forwarding address, nothing." Emily's fingers tightened around the paper. They erased her. "There's no death certificate, no hospital records, no police reports. It's like she vanished." Emily's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "They didn't even look for her. No one did." Mark rested a hand on hers. "But we are." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of decades. "I keep thinking," she whispered, "if she'd just told someone where she was going. If she'd left a note, anything." Mark looked at her. "What if she tried and someone made sure no one found it?" Emily stiffened. He continued, "My father was a powerful man, controlling. He didn't like anything that disrupted his version of order. If Alice discovered something that threatened that, he would have done anything to bury it." Emily nodded slowly, the implications sinking in. "And I was the collateral damage. You were the child left behind, and no one should have let that happen." She stared at him. "You're saying your family may have been involved in her disappearance?" Mark exhaled. "I don't want to believe that, but the signs are there." Emily stood and walked to the garden's edge. Sophie waved at her from the flower bed, her hands full of daisies. For years, Emily had clung to shadows of memories, dreams that felt like ghosts. But now she held real evidence, names, dates, faces, and maybe, just maybe, the truth. She turned back to Mark. "I want to find out what happened to her. All of it." Mark rose. "Then we do it together." Their eyes locked. Two people once separated by class, wealth, and time, now united by a shared past and the same mission: uncover the truth. Emily glanced down at the photo again. Her mother had not disappeared without a trace, and Emily Carter would no longer be the girl left behind. The rain came softly that evening, pattering on the roof of the guest house like whispers from the past. Inside, Emily sat at the dining table, the documents from Mark's folder spread out before her, the faded ink, the clipped language. Every piece felt like a breadcrumb left behind by someone who had tried to stay visible, only to be silenced. Mark had returned just before nightfall, having made calls to contacts in real estate and legal circles. He brought with him an old leather-bound journal, his mother's. "I remembered this was packed away in one of the attic trunks," he said, setting it on the table. "She kept journals for years. I thought maybe it could give us something." Emily opened the book delicately, the scent of dust and old paper rising from the pages. Handwritten entries filled the first few weeks, notes about social events, garden plans, charity functions, but then an entry from the same summer, the photo had been taken, caught her eye. Alice has been withdrawn lately. I'm not sure what's troubling her, but she keeps to herself. Mark seems fond of the little girl she brings when she works late. I caught them playing near the swing again. There's something gentle about her. Strange dreams lately. I keep feeling like we're being watched in our own home. Emily blinked, her finger frozen on the ink. She mentions me and my mom? Mark leaned over, reading the entry with her. There's more. Edward warned me not to get involved, says I'm imagining things, but Alice confided in me today. She said she overheard something in the study, something about an investment or a transaction my husband wasn't supposed to make. She seemed scared. I told her to be careful. I hope she didn't say anything to him. Emily's breath caught. She knew something. Mark nodded grimly. And she trusted your mom enough to listen, but if my father found out, he made her disappear, Emily finished. They sat in stunned silence. 1,000 possibilities spun in their minds, what Alice had heard, what she tried to do with that information, and what she'd been willing to risk for the truth. That night, Emily tucked Sophie into bed and lingered at her bedside. You're safe now, she whispered. I promise I'll never let anything happen to you. Later, on the porch under the rain-covered awning, Mark handed Emily a warm blanket and sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. The wind stirred the trees and thunder rumbled in the distance. Finally, Emily broke the silence. It doesn't make sense, you know. Why I remember you. Mark looked over. I have this feeling when I'm near you, like I've been here before. Like this life, this place, was always waiting. Mark nodded. Maybe we knew each other in ways we couldn't hold on to. She glanced down. It's strange. After all the years I spent surviving, now I'm scared of remembering. He turned toward her. You don't have to do it alone anymore. They sat in silence again, closer now. The rain fell in steady rhythm, like a heartbeat returning. And beneath that stormy sky, the distance between their two broken lives began to disappear. The next morning brought a clear sky and a storm of a different kind. Mark arrived at his downtown office to find a group of his board members waiting in the conference room. The atmosphere was colder than usual, the tension almost palpable. At the head of the table sat Gerald Parker, a longtime associate and investor, sharp-eyed, graying at the temples, and never one to tolerate surprises. We've heard rumors, Gerald began without preamble, that you've been involved with a homeless woman. Mark sat down slowly, setting his phone and notebook on the polished table. Her name is Emily Carter. She's an artist, and she's staying in one of my guest houses temporarily. Murmurs flickered around the room like sparks. Gerald raised an eyebrow. Mark, you're a public figure, a CEO. You run $1 billion company. We can't afford scandals or distractions. Mark's eyes narrowed. Helping someone in need is not a scandal. You know that's not the point. Another board member added, the press will twist it. Investors will panic. Questions about your judgment? Let them question it, Mark cut in. I won't apologize for doing the right thing. Gerald folded his hands. This woman, does she have any connection to the family? Mark hesitated. She might. Her mother worked for us years ago. She disappeared under suspicious circumstances. I believe my father was involved. Gasps. Shocked glances. You're accusing your father? Gerald asked, stunned. The man who built this company. I'm not accusing. I'm uncovering the truth. If it leads back to him, so be it. The silence that followed was heavy. For years, the Donovan name had stood for untouchable wealth and legacy. Now, Mark was threatening to shatter the illusion. We're warning you, Gerald said after a long pause. If this affects the company, the shareholders will demand action. You're walking a dangerous line. Mark stood. I'd rather walk a dangerous line than live a dishonest life. He left the room without another word. Back at the guest house, Emily could feel the shift the moment he stepped through the door. Mark's jaw was tight, his suit jacket folded over his arm instead of worn, unusual for him. Sophie was colouring on the floor, but she looked up at him and smiled. That softened him for a brief moment. Emily stood and approached him. What happened? Board meeting. They're not happy. Because of me. Because I care, he replied. Because I won't pretend you don't matter. Emily's voice dropped. You don't have to risk everything for me, Mark. He looked at her with fierce sincerity. Yes, I do. You and Sophie. You're not a burden. You're part of my life now. She took a deep breath. That's hard to believe, after years of being invisible. Then let me be the one who sees you. A long pause passed between them. Mark sat on the couch and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. They threaten to force me out if I keep pushing this. And what will you do? He looked up. I'll keep pushing. Because this isn't just about business. It's about who I want to be. Emily sat beside him. Then we fight together. They shared a glance full of silent courage. Outside, the world spun on with its expectations and whispers. But inside this house, something stronger was building. Not a scandal, a family. A week passed. Emily was beginning to feel the strange weight of stability, a sensation both foreign and fragile. For the first time in years, she had clean clothes, warm meals, and a bed for Sophie that wasn't the back of a church or a makeshift pile of blankets in a city alley. Yet, as comfort crept in, so did uncertainty. Mark had grown increasingly busy. Meetings, calls, discreet legal inquiries. He came back late some nights, exhausted but still managing a warm smile for Sophie and a check-in with Emily. But part of her wondered, was this just a passing charity? A man easing his guilt or trying to rewrite his family's past? The question gnawed at her. That afternoon, Emily found herself sitting alone in the guest house garden, staring at a half-finished sketch of the old oak tree. Her fingers were smudged with charcoal, but her mind was far away. Was this real, or was she setting herself up for another heartbreak? Sophie's laughter pulled her out of her thoughts. The little girl was playing with a small stuffed bear that Mark had bought her from a nearby boutique. She'd named it Mr. Buttons and carried it everywhere. "Mommy, look!" Sophie called, holding up a drawing she had made. 3 stick figures holding hands under a big tree. Emily smiled, but her heart ached. That evening, Mark returned earlier than expected. He brought Thai food and news. His investigator had found a retired housemaid who had worked alongside Alice Carter decades ago. "She's in a senior home across town," Mark explained. "Says she remembers Alice well. Said there were things she was too scared to talk about back then, but now she's ready." Emily nodded, absorbing the weight of it. "I want to go with you." "I was hoping you'd say that." Later that night, as Sophie slept soundly with Mr. Buttons beside her, Emily and Mark sat outside under the stars. A lantern glowed beside them, casting warm light over the porch. "I need to ask you something," Emily said quietly. Mark turned, to her, attentive. "Why are you really doing all this? What do you mean?" "I mean, me, Sophie. This isn't your world, and I keep thinking maybe you just feel responsible, or maybe it's guilt. But if it's just pity, I can't stay." Mark's face tensed with hurt, but he didn't flinch. "It's not pity, Emily. It's connection. It's truth. It's the way Sophie runs to me like I've known her my whole life. It's the way your drawings echo parts of myself I forgot. And maybe it's also love, or the start of it." Emily's eyes widened slightly, breath catching. Mark added, "I don't know where this ends, but I know it matters. You matter." She looked away for a moment, overwhelmed. No one had ever said those words to her. Not like that. When she finally turned back, her voice was steady. Then I'll stop running, and I'll believe you, one step at a time. He smiled, more with his eyes than his lips. They sat in silence after that, the space between them no longer filled with doubts, but possibility. And in the house behind, them, Sophie dreamed peacefully beneath her blanket, her little hand curled tightly around Mr. Button's. A home was beginning to take shape, not of walls or money, but of trust. The senior care facility was quiet, nestled in a tree-lined neighborhood just beyond the city. Sunlight filtered through wide windows in the visitor lounge, illuminating the dust motes that floated gently in the air. Mark and Emily waited in silence, each holding their thoughts like fragile glass. A nurse led them down a carpeted hallway and into a small sitting room, where a silver-haired woman in a pale lavender cardigan sat knitting, her hands slightly trembling but precise. "Mrs. Dolores Hatcher?" Mark asked gently. The woman looked up. Her pale blue eyes focused slowly, then widened. "You're a Donovan." Mark nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mark Donovan. This is Emily Carter." At the sound of the name, Dolores's knitting needles paused. Her lips parted in disbelief. "Carter? Alice Carter's daughter?" Emily stepped forward, her voice barely steady. "Yes. Do you remember her?" Dolores set the yarn aside and folded her hands in her lap. "Child, I remember Alice like it was yesterday. She was kind, quiet, too smart for her position, really, and she adored you." Emily swallowed hard. Dolores motioned for them to sit. "Your mama didn't deserve what happened." Mark leaned in. "We were hoping you could tell us the truth." Dolores nodded, glancing out the window before speaking, as if checking for ghosts. "Your father, Edward Donovan, he was involved in something back then. Something secret. I never knew the details, but there were strange meetings at the house. Locked doors, late-night arguments. Alice, she accidentally overheard something she shouldn't have." Emily tensed. "And then?" "She came to me in tears one night, said she was scared, said she thought they'd found out she knew. She had packed a bag, said she was going to take you and leave, said she'd written a letter and left it with someone she trusted just in case." Mark frowned. What happened next? Dolores looked at Emily with sorrow. "The next morning she was gone. The police came a week later, asking if she'd run off with money. But I knew better. She didn't take her savings. She didn't take her best shoes, just disappeared." Emily's eyes shimmered. "She didn't leave me. No, baby, she was trying to protect you. Whatever she knew, someone made sure she wouldn't talk." Mark sat back, his mind reeling. "And the letter? Did you know who she gave it to?" Dolores shook her head. "She never said. Only that it was someone who'd know when the time was right." Silence lingered. Finally, Dolores reached for Emily's hand. "Your mother loved you fiercely, that much I know, and now you've come back for the truth. That would make her proud." Tears slipped silently down Emily's cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak. Later that evening, back at the estate, Emily stood alone in the garden, the journal and documents spread before her like puzzle pieces. The truth was coming into focus, but pieces were still missing. Mark joined her quietly. "You okay?" She nodded. "That woman, she remembered my mom, not as a housekeeper, but as a person, a mother. You were never forgotten, Emily. I was, but not by her." A long pause. Then Emily looked at him. "There's still the letter." "We'll find it," Mark promised. She stepped closer to him, just enough for their hands to brush. "I believe you now." Mark turned, his voice quiet. "And I believe in you." The garden fell silent as the sun dipped below the horizon. A quiet knowing passed between them. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The following days moved quickly, quietly but with purpose. Mark and Emily sifted through layers of family archives, legal records, and old contacts. Each document, each photograph, each phone call was a thread being pulled from the fabric of a buried past. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Alice Carter hadn't simply vanished. She had been silenced, and Mark was ready to make it right. On Friday morning, he arrived at the headquarters of Donovan Enterprises with his tie loosened and resolve sharpened. The lobby was already buzzing with tension. News had spread that a press conference was scheduled for that afternoon, with Mark Donovan personally speaking. Gerald Parker intercepted him near the elevators. "You're making a mistake," Gerald hissed. "The board doesn't support this. You're going to drag our legacy through the mud for the sake of some forgotten servant." Mark met his eyes. Her name was Alice, and she wasn't forgotten. Not by her daughter, not by me. "The media will crucify your family, and you with it." "Then let them," Mark said. "We've been worshipping a lie for decades." Without waiting for a reply, he stepped into the elevator, the doors closing silently behind him. At 2 p.m., cameras flashed in the conference room. Reporters packed the aisles, whispering furiously as Mark took the podium. He wore no prepared smile, no corporate polish, just a navy shirt, sleeves rolled, and the weight of truth in his posture. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I stand here not as a CEO, but as a son, a brother, a man who has recently uncovered a painful piece of his family's past." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Over 30 years ago, a woman named Alice Carter worked for my family. She disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Until recently, I didn't know her name. But now I know her story. I know that she tried to speak up about something she believed was wrong. And I believe she paid for it with her life." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. She left behind a daughter, a child who was abandoned by a system that failed her, who grew up believing her mother had walked away, when in fact her mother had tried to protect her. Mark looked directly at the cameras. "I have found that daughter. Her name is Emily Carter, and I am proud to stand beside her, to say that she and her daughter Sophie are now part of my family." The room erupted in gasps, questions fired from all sides. Mark raised a hand. "I know this is unusual. It may even seem reckless, but doing the right thing often does. The truth is, we all have blind spots. For me, that blind spot was history, my own, my family's, and now that I can see clearly, I refuse to look away." He stepped back from the podium as flashes exploded around him. His chest rose and fell, but his expression was calm, liberated. That night, Emily watched the press conference replay from the guest house, her hands shaking as she held the remote. Sophie sat beside her, eyes wide with admiration. "Is that us he's talking about?" Sophie asked. Emily smiled through tears. Later, Mark returned to the guest house to find Emily waiting on the porch. She stood as he approached, and before he could speak, she wrapped her arms around him. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered into his chest. "Yes," he murmured, holding her tightly. "I did." When they pulled apart, Emily looked up at him. "You just changed everything." "No," he said, brushing her cheek gently. "You did." For the first time in her life, Emily Carter felt seen, not for her pain or her survival or her past, but for her strength, her truth, and the family she had fought to protect. And for Mark Donovan, love was no longer a memory buried in childhood. It was standing in front of him, holding his hand. Emily hadn't expected the world to take sides, but it did, fast. Within 24 hours of Mark's press conference, headlines exploded across media outlets. Some praised his bravery, hailing him as a visionary, breaking generational silence. Others painted it as reckless, questioning his motives, insinuating scandal. Photos of Emily and Sophie surfaced online, blurry shots from the guest house garden or at the grocery store, captioned with cruel speculation. The homeless woman behind the Donovan family divide. Emily tried to ignore it, but the comments found her. On social media, on the news, even whispered at the market. She doesn't belong with him. She's using him. She's just a charity case in designer hand-me-downs. One morning, she sat frozen on the couch, her laptop closed, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Mark walked in with coffee and saw the look on her face immediately. "What happened?" Emily said nothing at first, but then, "You stood up for me, and now they're tearing you down for it." Mark set the mugs aside and sat across from her. "Emily, I didn't ask for any of this," she said, voice shaking. "I didn't ask for cameras or headlines or judgment from strangers. I just wanted answers about my mom, a safe place for Sophie. That's all." "I know. Maybe we were better off being invisible." Mark leaned forward, gently cupping her hand. "You deserve more than invisibility. You deserve a life, dignity, respect, and so does Sophie." She looked at him, her defenses cracking. "But what if this ruins everything for you? Then everything was built on the wrong things to begin with." Silence. Then she lowered her head into his shoulder, letting herself breathe. Later that day, Emily took Sophie to a nearby park, needing distance from the screens and whispers. While Sophie played on the swings, Emily sat on a bench with her sketchbook open. Her hands moved automatically, charcoal flowing across the page. She didn't think, she just let the images come. When she looked down, she gasped. It was her, Mother, drawn in soft lines, standing under the old oak tree, one hand outstretched, a folded letter in her palm. Emily's pulse quickened. She flipped to a blank page and began drawing again, this time the face of someone she hadn't seen in years. A woman named Teresa James, her mother's closest friend from when she was a little girl in the foster system. Teresa had disappeared from Emily's life after her third foster placement, but Emily remembered her voice, her laugh, the way she always smelled of mint gum and peppermint lotion. And suddenly the memory clicked, her mother's words. "If something happens to me, find Teresa." Emily raced back to the guest house with Sophie in tow. Mark was on the porch reading a folder, but stood as soon as he saw her expression. "I know who might have the letter," Emily said breathlessly. "My mum gave it to someone she trusted, her friend, Teresa James." Mark's eyes lit up. "Can you find her?" "I'm going to try." That night, Mark's team began tracking down records of Teresa James. Old foster files, phone numbers, court documents. It took hours, but eventually a match surfaced. Teresa, now Teresa Holloway, living just 2 counties away, recently widowed, listed as an art therapist. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. "She's alive!" Mark touched her shoulder. "Then let's go find her." Emily glanced at Sophie, now fast asleep on the couch, cradling Mr. Buttons. This was no longer just about uncovering secrets. It was about reclaiming history, healing trauma, and finally stepping into a future that was rightfully hers. She reached for Mark's hand and squeezed it. "We're almost there." The drive to Teresa Holloway's home was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of tires over asphalt and the occasional gust of wind that rippled through the open windows. Emily stared out at the countryside, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Beside her, Mark drove with steady focus, occasionally glancing over, reading her silence. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, a modest one-story cottage with sun-faded shutters and a small porch. Wildflowers grew untamed along the edges of the fence, and a bird feeder swung gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, eerily so. Emily exhaled slowly as she stepped out of the car. "What if she doesn't remember me?" "She will," Mark said with quiet certainty. "And if she has the letter?" Emily nodded, unable to say more. She walked to the door and knocked. Moments later, a woman in her 60s answered. Her face was round and kind, streaks of grey running through tightly braided black hair. She wore a long sweater and held a half-finished painting in one hand. can I help?" Her voice stopped short as her eyes met Emily's. Something shifted in her expression. "My God, Emily!" Emily's breath caught. "You remember me?" Teresa dropped the canvas gently and stepped forward. "Of course I remember you. You were like a daughter to me once." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes. "I thought you were gone. After the second foster home, they moved me. I fought." "Yet they didn't care," Teresa said, wrapping Emily in a firm embrace. "I looked for you after I aged out, but you'd vanished into the system." Emily pulled back. "Teresa, I need to ask you something. It's about my mother, Alice Carter." Teresa's face changed again, grief mingling with a flicker of recognition. She slowly stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Inside, the living room was filled with light and paintings. Most were serene landscapes or portraits of children, vibrant and full of emotion. Mark stood quietly near the door as Emily and Teresa sat. "I never forgot her," Teresa said. Alice was brave. She knew something about the Donovans. She was scared. Emily leaned forward. "She told you?" "She told me just enough that she was going to expose something, and that if she didn't make it, I needed to keep her daughter safe. She gave me this." Teresa stood and walked to an old chest near the bookcase. From inside, she pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with time, edges brittle. Alice's name was written on the front in careful, slanted handwriting. Emily reached out with trembling hands. "She told me to give it to you when you were ready," Teresa whispered. Emily opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible, her mother's words unfolded in delicate script. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then I wasn't able to come back to you. But please know I never abandoned you. I tried to protect you from something bigger than I could fight alone. I discovered financial records, dangerous ones, inside Edward Donovan's study. Money being funneled through shell charities, human trafficking. I confronted him. I told the truth. And then I was warned. I tried to run, I tried to get help, but I knew they'd stop me. I just pray someone will help you find the truth someday, and that you'll know how much I loved you. You were the light of my life, Emily. I hope you grow up to be the strong woman I always saw in you. With all my love, Mom." Emily couldn't breathe. The world blurred. Mark gently took the letter and read it in stunned silence. Teresa placed a hand on Emily's back, grounding her. "She never stopped fighting for you," Emily sobbed. "She was murdered and everyone just moved on." Mark's voice was low and burning. "Not anymore." He stood. "We take this to the police. We reopen the case. We expose everything." Emily wiped her tears. "I want justice." Mark nodded. "Then that's exactly what we'll get." As they left, Teresa hugged Emily tightly. "She'd be so proud of you." For the first time in her life, Emily Carter walked away from the past not as a forgotten girl, but as a woman carrying her mother's legacy forward, and with Mark at her side, she wasn't walking alone. 2 weeks later, the Donovan estate no longer echoed with silence. It buzzed with the tension of a legacy unraveling. Mark stood in the grand conference room of his company's headquarters, facing not only the board but a team of investigators, legal advisors, and a detective from the state attorney's office. Spread before them were documents, bank records, and the original letter written by Alice Carter. The truth was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Mark's voice was steady as he spoke. "My father used this company to funnel donations into shell charities that never existed. He used them to hide assets and to mask a trafficking ring connected to one of our logistics partners. Alice Carter found out. She tried to warn someone, and instead she disappeared." Gasps broke around the room. Gerald Parker looked pale. This could destroy everything we've built." Mark looked him dead in the eye. "Then it deserves to fall." The attorney beside him stepped forward. We've submitted the evidence to the district attorney. There will be a formal inquiry, possibly criminal charges for those still alive who were complicit. Some of the board members stood, outraged. Others simply bowed their heads in shame. Mark turned to the crowd. You can choose to cover this up, or you can help me rebuild this company on truth. He didn't wait for their answers. That evening, Mark returned to the guest house. Emily and Sophie were in the garden, Sophie chasing fireflies, Emily reading aloud from an old storybook. As Mark stepped into the light of the porch, Emily looked up, concern in her eyes. "Well?" she asked. "It's done," he said. "The case is open, and I stepped down as CEO this morning." Emily stood. "You what?" "I'm going to restructure the company as a charitable foundation. Real work, real change, and I don't want my name on the top floor while this legacy still bleeds." She walked toward him, heart in her throat. "Mark, you didn't have to give up everything." "I didn't," he said, brushing her hair back from her face. "I gave up what wasn't real to make space for what is." He pulled a small folder from his jacket and handed it to her. Inside were finalized documents, a trust for Sophie's education, a deed for the guest house in Emily's name, and a note in his handwriting: "You never needed rescuing, but I've never met anyone stronger to build a life beside." Mark. Tears filled her eyes. "Why would you do this for me?" He smiled gently. "Because I love you." Her breath caught. He stepped closer. "I don't know what our future looks like, but I know it should be with you in it. Both of you." Emily looked past him to Sophie, now holding a firefly cupped in her palms, giggling. Then back at Mark. She didn't say, "I love you" back, not yet, but she reached for his hand and held it tightly. That was enough. Over the next few weeks, Emily adjusted to life, not defined by survival, but by choice. She began painting again, on canvas, not just paper. Her work, raw and emotional, caught the attention of a local gallery owner. Soon, her pieces were hanging in windows, then in exhibits. Sophie enrolled in school for the first time, and every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered for dinner, Mark, Emily, and Sophie, under the same oak tree that once stood alone in their dreams. The past had not been erased, but it no longer held them hostage. Together, they had reclaimed the truth, and with it, the future. 1 year later. The Donovan estate looked different now. The sprawling lawns still rolled across the hills, and the great oak tree still cast its wide, dappled shade across the yard. But the mansion had become quieter. No more high society galas or boardroom battles. Instead, the estate had been transformed into a non-profit arts and wellness center, a sanctuary for foster children, trauma survivors, and aspiring young artists. And at the heart of it all was Emily. She stood in the main gallery, sunlight pouring through the high arched windows, her fingers running over the frame of her newest piece, The Swing Beneath the Tree. A vivid acrylic rendering of the same moment that had once lived only in her dreams. A little boy and girl, mid-laugh, suspended in time. Behind her, applause erupted as the gallery filled with guests from all walks of life. Wealthy patrons, adopted teens, single mothers with stories etched into their eyes. Her first solo exhibition, titled Unseen, had just opened. "Ladies and gentlemen," the gallery owner announced, "it's my honor to introduce the artist who turned her past into purpose, Emily Carter." Emily stepped forward slowly, heart pounding, holding Sophie's small hand in hers. Mark stood just behind them, smiling with quiet pride, his arm wrapped around both their shoulders. She looked out over the crowd, then down at her daughter. "I spent most of my life believing I was invisible," she began. "That my story didn't matter, that I had to survive in the margins while the world looked away." She paused, scanning the faces before her. "But then someone saw me, and because of that, I started seeing myself." She glanced back at Mark. He helped me find my mother's truth. But more than that, he gave me the space to tell my own. The audience was silent, listening. I hope these paintings show you what love can rebuild, that what we lose doesn't have to define us, that justice is possible, even when it takes decades, and that family isn't about where you come from. It's about who refuses to leave your side when things fall apart. Applause filled the room. Sophie clapped the loudest, jumping up and down. Later that night under the stars, Mark and Emily sat on the porch of the guest house, their home. Sophie was asleep inside, curled up with Mr. Buttons, now stitched up and worn but still beloved. Emily leaned against Mark's shoulder, her voice soft. "I'm not afraid anymore." Mark kissed the top of her head. "Neither am I." They sat in silence for a long while, the breeze rustling the trees, the scent of lavender in the air. Finally, Emily whispered, "Do you ever think it's strange?" "What is?" "That one drawing, the one you bought from me, changed everything." Mark smiled. "It didn't change everything, it revealed it." She smiled too. "It brought us home. There was nothing more to prove, no more shadows to chase, no more truths left buried. What began with a forgotten drawing had become a family, built from bravery and the quiet kind of love that doesn't ask to be noticed. They stood there together, in silence, and in that silence, there was peace. Some stories stay with us, not because they're perfect, but because they're true. If Emily's story touched something in you, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've carried questions that never had a place to land. This channel isn't just for watching stories, it's a space for telling them. So if you feel called to, share a piece of your journey in the comments. You might be surprised how many hearts echo yours. And if this story reminded you of someone you care about, someone who might need to hear that redemption is real, share it with them. And if this felt like home, we'd love to have you with us. Subscribe to Faith and Family Stories to walk with us through the next chapter, because your story matters, and this is a place where it's safe to tell it.